His back to us, was bending over it, motionless. Next to him stood a motorcycle policeman taking down names with much sweat and correction in a little book. At first I couldn't find the source of the high. Groaning words that echoed clamorous lie through the bare garage minus. Then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office. Some man was talking to him in a low voice and attempting from time to time to lay a hand on his shoulder. But Wills neither heard nor saw. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light to the laden table by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again, to give out incessantly his high, horrible call. Oh, my God, meine Sodi. Oh, my God, meine Sodi. Oh, my God, meine Sodi. Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk and, after staring around the garage with glazed eyes, addressed a mumbled, incoherent remark to the policeman. M minus, B minus, V minus. The policeman was saying, minus, minus, so minus, 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 or minus, corrected the man. Minus, a minus, V minus, or minus, so minus, 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 minus. Listen to me, muttered Tom fiercely. Or minus, said the policeman. Well, minus, 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 Johnny's minus, minus, Joe minus. Minus. He looked up as Tom's broad hand fell sharply on his shoulder. What you want, fella? What happened minus, that's what I want to know. Auto hit her. Instant-like killed. Instantly killed. Repeated Tom, staring. She ran out in a road. Sun minus of minus bitch didn't even stop us car. There was 2 cars, said Mike Ellis. One come in, one going. See? Going where? Asked the policeman keenly. One go in each way. Well, she minus, his hand rose toward the blankets, but stopped halfway and fell to his side. Minus, she ran out there, and the one cone in from N. Yoke knock right into her go, in 30 or 40 miles an hour. What's the name of this place here? Demanded the officer. Hasn't got any name. A pale, well, minus-dressed Negro stepped near. It was a yellow car, he said. Big yellow car. Near. See the accident? Asked the policeman. No, but the car passed me down the road. Going 50, 60. Come here and let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name. Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson swaying in the office door. For suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was. Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and standing in front of him, seized him firmly by the upper arms, Listen, said Tom, shaking him a little. I just got here a minute ago. From New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine. Do you hear? I haven't seen it all afternoon. Only the Negro and I were near enough to hear what he said. But the policeman caught something in the tone, and looked over with truculent eyes. What's all that? He demanded. I'm a friend of his. Tom turned his head, but kept his hands firm on Wilson's body. Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. And what color's your car? It's a blue car, a coupe. We've come straight from New York, I said. Someone who had been driving a little behind us confirmed this, and the policeman turned away. Now, if you'll let me have that name. Again, correct minus. Picking up Wilson like a doll, Tom carried him into the office. Set him down in a chair and came back. If somebody yellow come, he ran sit with him. He snapped authoritatively. He watched while the two men standing closest glanced at each other, and went unwillingly into the room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the single step, his eyes avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered, "Let's get out." Case in hand, who had been sent for in Wild Hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend minus. Then his foot came down hard, and the coupe raced along through the night. In a little while I heard a low husky sob and saw that the tears were overflowing down his face. The damn coward. He whimpered. He didn't even stop his car. The Buchanan's house floated suddenly toward us through the dark, rustling trees. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor where two windows bloomed with light among the vines. "Daisy's home," he said. As we got out of the car, he glanced at me and frowned slightly. "I ought to have dropped you in West Beg, Nick. There's nothing we can do tonight." A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely and with decision. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. "I'll telephone for a taxi to take you home. And while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them get you some supper minus, if you want any." He opened the door. "Come in." "No thanks. But I'd be glad if you'd order me the taxi." "I'll wait outside." Jordan put her hand on my arm. "Won't you come in?" "Nick? No thanks. I was feeling a little sick and I wanted to be alone." But Jordan lingered for a moment more. "It's only 9:30, she said. I'd be damned if I'd go and I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands. Until I heard the phone taken up inside. Then the butler's voice calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped from between two bushes into the path. I must have felt pretty weird by the time, because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. "What are you doing?" I inquired. "Just standing here." Old sport. Somehow, that seemed a despicable occupation. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. I wouldn't have been surprised to see sinister faces. The faces of Wolf Shiam's people behind him in the dark shrubbery. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a minute. "Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yes. I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that the shock should all come at once. She stood it pretty well." He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered. "I got to West Egg by a side road," he went on, "and left the car in my garage. "Who was the woman?" he inquired. "Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage. How the devil did it happen?" "Yes," he said after a moment. "But of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous and she thought it would steady her to drive minus. And this woman rushed out at us as we were passing a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute, but it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us. Thought we were somebody she knew. Well, first Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car. And then she lost her nerve and turned back. The second my hand reached the wheel, I felt the shock minus. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open minus. Don't tell me, old sport. He winced. Anyhow, minus, Daisy stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't, so I pulled on the emergency brake. Then she fell over into my lap and I drove on. "She'll be all right tomorrow," he said pleasantly. "I'm just going to wait here and see if he tries to bother her about that unpleasantness this afternoon. She's locked herself into her room, and if he tries any brutality, she's going to turn the light out and on again." "He won't touch her," I said. "He's not thinking about her." "I don't trust him, old sport. How long are you going to wait? All night if necessary. Anyhow, till they all go to bed. A new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection in it minus minus. He might think anything. I looked at the house. There were 2 or 3 bright windows downstairs, and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the 2nd floor. You wait here, I said. I'll see if there's any sign of a commotion. I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing minus room curtains were open, and I saw that the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we had dined that June night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of light, which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale minus minus, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I had left him in the drive. "Is it all quiet up there?" he asked anxiously. "Yes." He shook his head. "I want to wait here till Daisy goes to bed." "Good night, old sport." He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight minus minus, watching over nothing. Chapter 8. I couldn't sleep all night. A fog minus horn was groaning incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half minus, sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up Gatsby's drive, and immediately I jumped out of bed and began to dress minus minus. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late. Crossing his lawn, I saw that his front door was still open, and he was leaning against a table in the hall, heavy with dejection or sleep. "Nothing happened," he said warmly. I waited, and about 4 o'clock she came to the window and stood there for a minute, and then turned out the light. We pushed aside curtains that were like pavilions and felt over innumerable feet of dark wall for electric lights, which as minus once I tumbled, with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere, and the rooms were musty, as though they hadn't been aired for many days. I found the humidor on an unfamiliar table with 2 staled rye cigarettes inside. Throwing open the French windows of the drawing minus room, we sit smoking out into the darkness. "You ought to go away," I said. "It's pretty certain they'll trace your car. Go away, N.O.W., old sport. Go to Atlantic City for a week. Or up to Montreal." He wouldn't consider it. He couldn't possibly leave Daisy until he knew what she was going to do. He was clutching at some lost hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Don Cody minus. Told it to me because Great Gatsby had broken up like La Black Lass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. I think that he would have acknowledged anything now, without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him minus. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there minus. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. There was a right mystery about it. A hint of bedrooms, upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms. Of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musky and laid away already in lavender, but freshened breathing and redolent of this year's shining motor cars, and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. He felt their presence all about the house, pervading the air with the shades and echoes of still vibrant emotions. He was at present a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get. Reverently and unscrupulously minus eventually, he took Daisy one still October night. Took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. He might have despised himself, for he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. But he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same stratum as herself minus, that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities minus. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable, at the whim of an impersonal government, to be blown anywhere about the world. But he didn't despise himself, and it didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended, probably, to take what he couldn't go minus, but now he had committed himself to the following of a grail. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby minus nothing. He felt married to her. When they met again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of star-minus shine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice husky, and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her. But she didn't, because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute. And all of a sudden we didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I could have a better time telling her what I was going to do? Silent time. It was a cold fall day, with fire in the room when her cheeks flushed. Now, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in the month of love, nor communicated more profoundly one with another than when she brushed silent lips against his coat shoulder, or when he touched the end of her fingers. Gently, as though she were asleep. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority and the command of the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her, and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant. Cheerful snobbery and orchestras would set the rhythm of the year. Summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. At the great hour there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low sweet fever. Through this twilight universe Daisy began to move again with the seas, and suddenly she was again keeping half a dozen men and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress angled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately minus, and the decision must be made by some first minus of love. Of money, of unquestionable practicality, minus that was close at hand, that first took shape in the middle of spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome brokenness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless, there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. Filling the house with great earning, gold-turning light. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. There was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from a window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her minus. This and the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. Just for a minute, when they were first married minus, and loved me more even then. Do you see? Suddenly he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. What could you make of that? And made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last of his army pay. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night, and revisiting the out minus of minus, the minus way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses saw his idea of the city itself. Even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty, he left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her minus, that he was leaving her behind. The day minus coach minus, he was penniless now minus was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding minus chair. And the station slid away, and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then out into the spring fields, where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute with people in it, who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along the casual street. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun which, as its ank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it. The freshest and the best forever. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's from her servants, came to the foot of the steps. "I'm going to drain the pool today. Mr. Gatsby, leaves LL start falling pretty soon, and then there's always trouble with the pipes. Don't do it today," Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. "You know, old sport, I've never used that pool all summer." I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work, but it was more than that minus. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed the train, and then another, before I could get myself away. "I'll call you up," I said finally. "Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon." We walked slowly down the steps. I suppose Lazy L called too. I suppose so. Well, minus goodbye. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted it across the lawn. "You're worth the hold and bunch put together." I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption minus, and he had stood on those steps. concealing his incorrigible dream as he waved them goodbye. Goodbye, I called. I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby. Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock. Then I fell asleep in my swivel-minus chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me, and I started up with sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between hotels and clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a devote from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window. But this morning, it seemed harsh and dry. I've left Daisy's house, she said. I'm at Hempstead, and I'm going down to Southampton this afternoon. Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. You weren't so nice to me last night. How could it have mattered then? Silence for a moment. Then, however, I want to see you. I want to see you too. Suppose I don't go to Southampton and come into town this afternoon? No, I don't think this afternoon. Very well. It's impossible this afternoon. Various minus. We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I don't know which of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across the T-minus table that day if I never talked to her again in this world. I called Gatsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried for times. Finally, an exasperated central told me the wire was being kept open for long distance from Detroit. Taking out my T-minus table, I drew a small circle around the 3-50 train. Then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. When I passed the ash heaps on the train that morning, I had crossed deliberately to the other side of the car. I suppose there'd be a curious crowd around their oars searching for dark spots in the dust, and an garrulous man telling over and over what had happened until it became less, and he could tell it no longer, and Marshall Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. Now, I want to go back a little and tell what happened at the garage after we left there the night before. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she arrived, she was stupid with liquor and understand that the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. When they convinced her of this, she immediately fainted, as if that was the intolerable part of the affair. Until long after midnight, a changing crowd leapt up against the front of the garage while Jules rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. For a while, the door of the office was open, and everyone who came into the garage glanced irresistibly through it. Finally, someone said it was a shame and closed the door. Mike Ellis and several other men were with him, minus first 4 or 5 men. Later, 2 or 3 men. Still later, Mike Ellis had to ask the last stranger to wait there 15 minutes longer while he went back to his own place and made a pot of coffee. After that, he stayed there alone with Wilson until dawn. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent minus. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. And then he blurted out that a couple of months ago his wife had come from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry out, "My God." Again, in his groaning voice, Mike Ellis made a clumsy attempt to distract him. "How long have you been married, George? Come on there. Try. And sit still a minute and answer my question. How long have you been married?" 12 years. Ever had any children? Come on, George. Sit still, minus. I asked you a question. Did you ever have any children? The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Mike Ellis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like the car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying, so he moved uncomfortably around the office minus. He knew every object in it before morning minus. And time to time sat down beside Wilson, trying to keep him more quiet. Have you got a church you go to sometimes, George? Maybe even if you haven't been there for a long time? Maybe I could call up the church and get a priest to come over, and he could talk to you. See? Don't belong to any. You ought to have a church. George, for times like this, you must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George. Listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church? That was a long time ago. The effort of answering broke the rhythm of his rocking minus for a moment. He was silent. Then the same half-knowing, half-bewildered look came back into his faded eyes. Look in the drawer there, he said, pointing at the desk. Which drawer? That drawer minus, that one. Mike Ellis opened the drawer nearest his hand. There was nothing in it but a small expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. It was apparently new. This? He inquired, holding it up. Wilson stared and nodded. I found it yesterday afternoon. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny. You mean your wife bought it? She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau. Mike Ellis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought the dog leash. from Myrtle, because he began saying, "Oh, my God." Again, in a whisper minus, his comforter left several explanations in the air. "Then he killed her," said Wilson. His mouth dropped open suddenly. "Who did?" "I have a way of finding out." "You're morbid." "George," said his friend. "This has been a strain to you, and you don't know what you're saying. You'd better try and sit quiet till morning. He murdered her. It was an accident, George." Wilson shook his head. His eyes narrowed and his mouth widened slightly with the ghost of a superior. "I know," he said definitely. "I'm one of these trusting fellas, and I don't think any harm to a nobody. But when I get to know a thing, I know it. It was the man in that car." He believed that Mrs. Wilson had been running away from her husband. Rather than trying to stop any particular car, how could she have been like that? "She's a deep one," said Wilson, as if that answered the question. "Maybe you got some friend that I could telephone for, George?" This was a forlorn hope minus. He was almost sure that Wilson had no friend. There was not enough of him for his wife. He was glad a little later when he noticed a change in the room. A blue quickening by the window, and realized that dawn wasn't far off. "I spoke to her," he muttered, after a long silence. "I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window minus. With an effort, he got up and walked to the rear window and leaned with his face pressed against it. Minus, and I said, "God knows what you've been doing. Everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God." Standing behind him, my killers saw with a shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T. "God sees everything," repeated Wilson. "That's an advertisement," Michaelis assured him. Something made him turn away from the window and look back into the room. But Wilson stood there a long time, his face close to the window pane, nodding into the twilight. By 6 o'clock, Michaelis was worn out and grateful for the sound of a car stepping outside. His movements minus, he was on foot. All the time minus were afterward traced to Port Roosevelt, and then to Gad's Hill, where he bought his, and which that he didn't eat and a cup of coffee. He must have been tired and walking slowly, for he didn't reach Gad's Hill until noon. Thus far there was no difficulty in accounting for his time minus, minus there were boys who had seen him and acting sort of crazy, and motorists at whom he stared oddly from the side of the road. Then for 3 hours he disappeared from view. The police, on the strength of what he said to my Callis, that he had a way of finding out, supposed that he spent the time going from garage to garage thereabouts inquiring for a yellow car. On the other hand, no garage man who had seen him ever came forward, minus, and perhaps he had an easier, surer way of finding out what he wanted to know. By 2:30 he was in West Egg, where he asked someone the way to Gatsby's house. So by that time he knew Gatsby's name. At 2 o'clock Gatsby put on his bathing suit and left word with the butler that if anyone phoned, word was to be brought to him at the pool. He stopped at the garage for a pneumatic mattress that had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helped him pump it up. Then he gave instructions that the open car wasn't to be taken out under any circumstances, minus, and this was strange, because the front right fender needed repair. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. But he shook his head and, in a moment, disappeared among the yellowing trees. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock minus, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing arose. Isn't how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. I drove from the station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. For of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other, with little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves. The laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly, tracing, like the leg of compass, a thin red circle in the water. And the Holocaust was complete. Chapter 9. After 2 years, I remember the rest of that day. And at night and the next day, only as an endless drill of police and photographers and a newspaperman in and out of Gatsby's front door. A rope stretched across the main gate and a policeman bide kept out the curious. But little boys soon discovered that they could enter through my yard. There were always a few of them clustered open-mouthed about the pool. Someone with a positive manner, perhaps a detective, used the expression madman as he bent over Wilson's body that afternoon, and the adventitious authority of his voice set the key for the newspaper reports next morning. Most of those reports were a nightmare minus grotesque, circumstantial, eager and untrue. When my Callus's testimony at the inquest brought to light Wilson's suspicions of his wife, I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in racy Pasque when Aid but Catherine. That her sister was completely happy with her husband. That her sister had been into no mischief whatever. She convinced herself of it and cried into her handkerchief as if the very suggestion was more than she could endure. So Wilson was reduced to a man deranged by grief in order that the case might remain in its simplest form. And it rested there. But all this part of it seemed remote and unincisional. I found myself on Gatsby's side and alone. From the moment I telephoned news of the catastrophe to West Egg Village. Every surmise about him, and every practical question, and its Marquesonich, was referred to me. At first I was surprised and confused then. As he lay in his house, and didn't move or breathe or speak hour upon hour, it grew upon me that I was responsible. Because no one else was interested minus interested. I mean, I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him. Called her instinctively and without hesitation. But she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. Left no address. No. Say when they'd be back? No. Any idea where they are? How I could reach them? I don't know. Can't say. I wanted to get somebody for him. I wanted to go into the room where he lay and reassure him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry. Just trust me, and I'll get somebody for you minus Meyer. Wolf Shiem's name wasn't in the phone book. The butler gave me his office address on Broadway, and I called information. but by the time I had the number, it was long after 5 and no one answered the phone. Sorry. I'm afraid no one's there. I went back to the drawing room and thought, for an instant, that they were chance visitors. All these official people who suddenly filled it. But as they drew back the sheet and looked at Gatsby with unmoved eyes, his protest continued in my brain. Look here, old sport. You've got to get somebody from me. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone. Someone started to ask me questions, but I broke away, and going upstairs looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk minus. He'd never told me definitely that his parents were dead. A token forgotten violence staring down from the wall. Next morning, I sent the butler to New York with a letter to Wolf Shiem, which asked for information and urged him to come out on the next train. That request seemed superfluous when I wrote it. I was sure he'd start when he saw the newspapers. Just as I was sure there'd be a wire from Daisy before noon minus, but neither a wire nor Mr. Wolf Shiem arrived. No one arrived except more police and photographers and newspapermen. When the butler brought back Wolf Shiem's answer, I began to have a feeling of defiance, of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me against them all. Dear Mr. Carraway, this has been one of the most terrible shocks of my life to me. I hardly can believe it, that it is true at all. Such a mad act as that man did should make us all think. I cannot come down, now as I am tied up in some very important business, and cannot get mixed up in this thing now. If there is anything I can do a little later, let me know in a letter by Edgar. I hardly know where I am when I hear about a thing like this, and am completely knocked down and out. Yours truly, Emmy, YRWLFS, HIEM, and then hasty or deadened beneath. When the phone rang that afternoon and long distance said Chicago was calling, I thought this would be Daisy at last. This is Slagle speaking. Yes, the name was unfamiliar. Hell of a note, isn't it? Get my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter. They got a circular from New York giving him the numbers just 5 minutes before. What do you know about that, eh? You never can tell in these hick towns minus Nino's hello. I interrupted breathlessly. Look here, minus, this isn't Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Gatsby's dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the wire, followed by an exclamation, then a quick squawk as the connection was broken. I think it was on the third day that a telegram signed Henry C. Gets arrived from a town in Minnesota. It said only that the sender was leaving immediately and to postpone the funeral until he came. Bundled up in a long cheap holster against the warm September day. His eyes leaked continuously with excitement, and when I took the bag and umbrella from his hands, he began to pull so incessantly at his sparse grey beard that I had difficulty in getting off his coat. But he wouldn't eat, and the glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. I saw it in the Chicago newspaper, he said. It was all in the Chicago newspaper. His eyes, seeing nothing, moved ceaselessly about the room. I urged him. I don't want anything. I'm all right now. Mr. Minus Caraway. Well, I'm all right now. Where have they got Jimmy? I took him into the drawing minus room, where his son lay. After a little while, Mr. Gats opened the door and came out. His mouth ajar, his face flushed slightly, his eyes leaking isolated and unpunctual tears. He had reached an age where death no longer has the quality of ghastly surprise. And when he looked around him now, for the first time, and saw the heightened splendor of the hall, and the great rooms opening out from it into other rooms, his grief began to be mixed with an awed pride. I helped him to a bedroom upstairs. While he took off his coat and vest, I told him that all arrangements had been deferred until he came. I didn't know what you'd want, Mr. Gatsby. Gats is my name. Mr. Gats. I thought you might want to take the body west. Jimmy always liked it better down east. Mr. Minus, we were close friends. He had a big future before him. You know. He was only a young man, but he had a lot of brain power here. A man like James J. Hill. He'd have helped build up the country. That's true, I said, uncomfortably. He fumbled at the embroidered coverlet, trying to take it from the bed, and lay down stiffly. Minus was instantly asleep. That night, an obviously frightened person called up and demanded to know who I was before he would give his name. This is Mr. Caraway, I said. Oh, minus. He sounded relieved. This is Clip Springer. I was relieved to, for that seemed to promise another friend at Gatsby's grave. I didn't want it to be in the papers and draw sightseeing crowds, so I'd been calling up a few people myself. They were hard to find. The funeral's tomorrow, I said. 3 o'clock, here at the house. I wish you'd tell anybody who'd be interested. Oh, I will, he broke out hastily. Of course, I'm not likely to see anybody. But if I do, His tone made me suspicious. Of course, you'll be there yourself. Well, I'll certainly try. What I called up about is minus. Wait a minute. I interrupted. How about saying you'll come? Well, the fact is the truth of the matter is that I'm staying with some people up here in Greenwich, and they rather expect me to be with them tomorrow. In fact, there's a sort of picnic or something. Of course, I'll do my very best to get away. I ejaculated an unrestrained "huh," and he must have heard me, for he went on nervously. What I called up about was a pair of shoes I left there. I wonder if it'd be too much trouble to have the butler send them on. You see, they're tennis shoes and I'm sort of helpless without them. My address is care of B. F. Minus. I didn't hear the rest of the name because I hung up the receiver. After that I felt a certain shame for Gatsby minus. One gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he had got what he deserved. However, that was my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. The morning of the funeral I went up to New York to see Meyer Wolf. I couldn't seem to reach him any other way. The door that I pushed open on the advice of an elevator boy was marked the swastika holding company, and at first there didn't seem to be anyone inside. But when I'd shouted hello several times in vain, an argument broke out behind a partition, and presently a lovely Jewess appeared at an interior door and scrutinized me with black hostile eyes. "Nobody's in," she said. "Mr. Wolf, she's gone to Chicago." "Tune Leslie, inside. Please say that Mr. Carraway wants to see him. I can't get him back from Chicago, can I?" At this moment, a voice, unmistakably Wolf Sheehan's, called Stella from the other side of the door. "Leave your name on the desk," she said quickly. "I'll give it to him when he gets back." You young men think you can force your way in here any time. She scolded. "We're getting sick and tired of it. When I say he's in Chicago, he's in Chicago. I mentioned Gatsby. Oh, minus H." She looked at me over again. "Will you just minus what was your name?" She vanished. In a moment, Meyer Wolf stood solemnly in the doorway, holding out both hands. He drew me into his office, remarking in a reverent voice that it was a sad time for all of us, and offered me a cigar. My memory goes back to when I first met him. He said, "Our young major, just out of the army and covered over with medals he got in the war. He was so hard up, he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy some regular clothes. First time I saw him was when he come into Winnebrenner's pool room at 40-3rd Street and asked for a job. He hadn't eaten anything for a couple of days. "Come on, have some lunch with me," I said. He ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour. "Did you start him in business?" I inquired. "Start him?" "I made him." "Oh." "I raised him up out of nothing, right out of the gutter. I saw right away he was a fine-appearing, gentlemanly young man. And when he told me he was an Oxford, I knew I could use him good. I got him to join up in the American Legion, and he used to stand high there. Right off, he did some work for a client of mine up to Albany. I wondered if this partnership had included the World Series transaction in 1919. "Now he's dead," I said after a moment. "You were his closest friend, so I know you want to come to his funeral this afternoon." "I can't do it minus. I can't get mixed up in it," he said. When a man gets skill, I never like to get mixed up in it in any way. I keep out. When I was a young man, it was different minus if a friend of mine died. No matter how, I stuck with them to the end. You may think that's sentimental, but I mean it minus to the bitter end. I saw that for some reason of his own, he was determined not to come. So I stood up. "Are you a college man?" he inquired suddenly. "Let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he is alive and not after he is dead," he suggested. "After that, my own rule is to let everything alone." When I left his office, the sky had turned dark and I got back to West, like in a drizzle. Gats walking up and down excitedly in the hall. His pride in his son's possessions was continually increasing, and now he had something to show me. Jimmy sent me this picture. He took out his wallet with trembling fingers. Up there, it was a photograph of the house, cracked in the corners and dirty with many hands. And then sought admiration from my eyes. He had shown it so often that I think it was more real to him now than the house itself. Jimmy sent it to me. I think it's a very pretty picture. It shows up well. Very well. Had you seen him lately? He came out to see me 2 years ago and bought me the house I live in now. Of course we was broke up when he run off from home, but I see now there was a reason for it. He knew he had a big future in front of him. He seemed reluctant to put away the picture, held it for another minute. Lingering lie before my eyes. Then he returned the wallet and pulled from his pocket a ragged old copy of a book called Hopalong Cassidy. It just shows you. He opened it at the back cover and turned it around for me to see. On the last fly, minus leaf was printed the word S-C-A-G-D-U-L-E, and the dates September 12, 1906, and underneath rise from bed. 6.00 away. Le. Fifteen work 8.30 for 0.30p. Base boards. For 0.30 5.00 practice elocution. Poisoned how to attain at 5. 06.00 study needed inventions. 7.00 jar euro b. ENARALRES. Or yes, no wasting time at chapter S or name. In this fibrip, no more smoking or chewing bath. Every other day, read one improving book or magazine per week, save $5. Said the old man. It just shows you, don't it? It just shows you. Jimmy was bound to get ahead. He always had some resolves like this or something. Do you notice what he's got about improving his mind? He was always great for that. He told me I ate like a hog once and I beat him for it. He was reluctant to close the book, reading each item aloud, then looking eagerly at me. I think he rather expected me to copy down the list for my own use. A little before 3, the Lutheran minister arrived from Flushing, and I began to look involuntarily out the windows for other cars. So did Gatsby's father. And as the time passed and the servants came in and stood waiting in the hall, his eyes began to blink anxiously, and he spoke of the rain in a worried and certain way. The minister glanced several times at his watch, so I took him aside and asked him to wait for half an hour. But it wasn't any use. Nobody came. About 5 o'clock us reached the cemetery and stopped in a thick drizzle beside the gate minus first motor hearse. Horribly black and wet. Then Mr. Gatz. Then the minister. And I in the limousine. I looked around. It was the man with owl minus eyeglasses, whom I had found marveling over Gatsby's books in the library one night 3 months before. I'd never seen him since then. I don't know how he knew about the funeral, or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. I tried to think about Gatsby then for a moment. Man. Without resentment that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. Dimly I heard someone murmur, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on." And then the owl minus eyed man said amen to that in a brave voice. Amina's eyes spoke to me by the gate. I couldn't get to the house. Why? My God. They used to go there by the hundreds. He took off his glasses and wiped them again outside and in. The poor sun minus of minus a pitch, he said. One of my most vivid memories is of coming back west from prep school and later from college at Christmas time. Those who went farther than Chicago would gather in the old dim Union Station at 6 o'clock of a December evening with a few Chicago friends already caught up into their own holiday gate eyes to bid them a hasty goodbye. I remember the fur coats of the girls returning from Miss This or That, and the chatter of frozen breath in the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of old acquaintances and the matchings of invitations. Are you going to the Ordways? The Hersey's? The Schultz's? And the long green tickets clasped tight in our gloved hands. And last the murky yellow cars of the Chicago, Milwaukee and Street. All railroad looking cheerful as Christmas itself on the tracks beside the gate when we pulled out into the winter night and the real snow. Our snow began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by. A sharp wild breeze came suddenly into the air. We drew in deep breaths of it as we walked back from dinner through the cold vestibules, unutterably aware of our identity with this country for one strange hour before we melted indistinguishably into it again. Let my Middle West minus not the wheat or the prairies, or the lost sweet towns, but the thrilling, returning trains of my youth and the street lamps and sleigh bells in the frosty dark and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. I am part of that, a little solemn with the feel of those long winters I see now that this has been a story of the West. After all, minus Tom and Gatsby. Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common, which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. Even when the East excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the board. Sprawling, West Egga especially still figures in my more fantastic dreams. I see it as a night scene by El Greco Way 100 houses, at once conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen, overhanging sky and a lusterless moon. In the foreground, for solemn men in dress suits, are walking along the sidewalk with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Her hand, which dangles over the side, sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely the men turn in at a house minus the wrong house. But no one knows the woman's name, and no one cares. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air, and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff, on the line I decided to come back home. There was one thing to be done before I left. An awkward, unpleasant thing that perhaps had better have been let alone. But I wanted to leave things in order and not just trust that obliging and indifferent sea to sweep my refuse away. I saw Jordan Baker and talked over and around what had happened to us together and what had happened afterward to me. And she lay perfectly still, listening in a big chair. She was dressed to play golf, and I remember thinking she looked like a good illustration. Her chin raised a little, jauntily, her hair the color of an autumn leaf, her face the same brown tint as the fingerless glove on her knee. When I had finished, she told me, without comment, that she was engaged to another man. I doubted that though there were several, she could have married at a nod of her head, but I pretended to be surprised. For just a minute, I wondered if I wasn't making a mistake. Then, I thought it all over again quickly and got up to say goodbye. Nevertheless, you did throw me over, said Jordan suddenly. You threw me over on the telephone. I don't give a damn about you now, but it was a new experience for me, and I felt a little dizzy for a while. Minus, a conversation we had once about driving a car? Why minus, not exactly. You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride. I'm 30, I said. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. And half in love with her and tremendously sorry, I turned away. One afternoon late in October, I saw Tom Buchanan. He was walking ahead of me along Fifth Avenue in his alert, aggressive way, his hands out a little from his body, as if to fight off interference. Just as I slowed up to avoid overtaking him, he stopped, began frowning into the windows of a jewelry store. What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me? He said quickly, crazy as hell. I don't know. What's the matter with you? Tom, I inquired, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? He stared at me without a word, and I had guessed right about those missing hours. I started to turn away, but he took a step after me and grabbed my arm. I told him the truth, he said. He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave, and when I sent down word that we weren't, and he tried to force his way upstairs. His hand was on a revolver in his pocket. Every minute he was in the house minus. He broke off defiantly. What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He ran over like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. There was nothing I could say, except the one unintolerable fact that it wasn't true. And if you think I didn't have my share of suffering minus, look here. When I went to give up that flat and saw the damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. By God, it was awful minus. I couldn't forgive him or like him. But I saw that what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy minus. They smashed up things and creatures, and then retreated back into their money, or their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. Then he went into the jewelry store to buy a pearl necklace minus, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons minus. Rid of my provincial squeamishness forever. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left minus the grass on his lawn had grown as long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident, and perhaps he had made a story about it all his own. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him. When I got off the train, I spent my Saturday nights in New York, because those gaming Dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter faint and incessant from his garden, and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car there, and saw it stop at his front steps. On the last night, with my trunk packed into my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. On the white steps, an obscene word, scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick, stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it. Drawing my shoe rasping lie along the stone. Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big short places were closed now. Moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the Anesnatalia houses began to melt away, until gradually I became aware of the old island, you that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes minus afresh. Green breast of the new world, its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, at once banded in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired. Face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that snow matter minus tomorrow, we will run faster. Stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, minus, so we beat on. Boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.